cued a clearing near Bols, Belgium. May 18, 1944, just after 4 in the afternoon. A young Belgian resistance fighter named Henri lies flat in a ditch beside a farm track, his heart hammering against wet earth. 20 meters away, a German Panzer IV grinds along the lane, its engine note rising and falling as the driver negotiates a rut. Henri is not carrying a rifle. He is gripping something that looks almost comical, a glass globe, roughly the size of a cricket ball, wrapped in a woolen sock and coated in a thick treacle-like adhesive. Inside that glass is nitroglycerin. He has perhaps 3 seconds to act before the tank passes beyond reach. He rises, sprints 2 paces, and slaps the device against the tank's rear engine deck. It sticks immediately, the sock anchoring the glue to the hot metal. He pulls a pin, drops flat, and counts. 5 seconds later, there is a flat, percussive crack, nothing like the cinematic explosions of later war films, more like a heavy door slamming in an empty house, but it is enough. Burning adhesive and molten metal punch downward into the engine bay. The Panzer does not explode in a fireball. It simply stops. The engine dies, smoke curls from the luves, and the crew bail out into rifle fire from Henri's comrades hidden in the hedgerow. This is the story of the No. 74 grenade, anti-tank, more commonly known by its nickname, the sticky bomb, a weapon born out of desperation, built in secret, and quietly written out of official histories because it was, by the Army's own admission, dangerous to use and embarrassing to acknowledge. Yet for thousands of resistance fighters, Home Guard volunteers, and regular infantrymen with nothing else to hand, it was the difference between watching a tank roll past unopposed and stopping it dead in its tracks. To understand why Britain needed something as crude and risky as the sticky bomb, you have to go back to the summer of 1940 in the weeks after Dunkirk. The British Army had left the overwhelming majority of its anti-tank guns, lorries, and heavy equipment on the beaches and in the fields of northern France. What remained at home was a patchwork of regular units rebuilding from almost nothing, alongside the newly formed Home Guard, a force of roughly 1.5 million men, many of them too old or too young for frontline service, equipped initially with shotguns, pikes, and, in some recorded cases, golf clubs. Against this stood the very real prospect of a German invasion fleet supported by armor. British planners had to assume that Wehrmacht tanks, the same Panzer IIIs and IVs that had cut through French defenses in weeks, might be rolling across Kent and Sussex by autumn. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, the standard infantry anti-armor weapon of the period, fired a 13.9 mm round that could, under ideal conditions, penetrate perhaps 20 millimeters of armor at 300 meters. German tank armor by 1940 was already exceeding that thickness on frontal plates and would only get thicker. The weapon was, in practical terms, already obsolete against the vehicles it was meant to stop. There was no PIAT yet. That weapon would not enter service until 1943. There were no bazooka equivalents. What existed was a gap, stark and frightening, between the threat on paper and the tools available to civilian volunteers and depleted regular units. Winston Churchill, freshly installed as Prime Minister, understood this gap better than most, and he wanted solutions that did not require years of conventional weapons development. He wanted something that could be designed in weeks and manufactured in months, using whatever materials and factories Britain could spare. The answer came not from the traditional ordnance establishment at Woolwich, but from an unconventional unit operating out of a Victorian country house called the Frythe, near Welwyn in Hertfordshire. This was MD1, the Ministry of Defence 1 research station, though its staff and Churchill himself preferred a more evocative name, Churchill's Toy Shop. It was run by Major Millis Jefferis, an engineer with a gift for improvisation, working under the patronage of Churchill's scientific advisor, Major Desmond Morton. The unit's brief was simple and almost unprecedented in its informality. Invent whatever was needed as fast as possible and worry about bureaucratic approval afterward. Jeffers and his small team, numbering perhaps 24 designers and engineers at any given time, approached the tank problem from an unusual angle. Rather than trying to punch a hole through armor with a projectile, which required either high velocity or a shaped explosive charge, both of which demanded sophisticated engineering, they asked a simpler question. What if you could simply attach a large enough quantity of explosive directly onto the tank's skin? This was not a new idea in principle. Demolition charges had existed for decades, but the challenge was making the charge stick reliably to a moving, vibrating, often oily and mud-caked surface under combat conditions, using a device an untrained soldier could carry and deploy in seconds. The solution Jeffers settled on was almost alchemical in its simplicity. A thin glass sphere, roughly 130 millimeters in diameter, was filled with nitroglycerin, the same explosive compound used in dynamite, chosen because it was powerful relative to its volume and did not require a complex detonation train to function reliably. Around this glass globe, the team wrapped a woolen sock, and over the sock they applied a birdlime-based adhesive, a sticky compound traditionally used by gamekeepers to trap small birds on branches. The genius, if it can be called that, lay in the layering. The glass kept the volatile explosive stable and contained until the moment of use. The sock gave the adhesive something to grip rather than simply smearing across smooth glass. The adhesive itself was strong enough to bond to filthy, oily tank armor within a second of contact, which conventional tape or glue could not reliably do. A metal canister housed the whole assembly to protect it during transport, split into two halves that fell away when the soldier squeezed a handle, exposing the sticky surface in a single motion. The completed weapon weighed roughly 1.02 kilograms, light enough to be thrown a short distance if direct contact was too dangerous, though throwing reduced both range and the certainty of adhesion. A textile retaining pin, not unlike that on a standard grenade, armed a 5-second fuse once pulled. In testing, the explosive force was sufficient to punch through 25 to 30 millimeters of armor plate at the point of contact, enough to disable engine compartments, tracks, or wheel assemblies on contemporary German tanks, even if it rarely achieved the catastrophic ammunition-detonating kills of larger anti-tank weapons. Manufacturing began in late 1940, dispersed across several British factories to maintain secrecy and resilience against bombing, with key production associated with sites in the Midlands. Exact production figures remain difficult to verify with certainty, since wartime records for MD-1 devices were often deliberately thin or have since been lost. But surviving ordnance records suggest that several million units were eventually produced and issued, principally to the Home Guard, though stocks also reached regular Army units and, crucially, the Special Operations Executive, who saw immediate value in a compact, deniable anti-armor weapon that resistance networks across occupied Europe could be trained to use within an afternoon. The weapon's most serious flaw became apparent almost immediately during trials and was never fully resolved. The birdlime adhesive, while excellent at sticking to tank armor, was equally effective at sticking to woolen battle dress, webbing, rifle slings, and human skin. Soldiers training with inert practice versions reported the bomb adhering to their own uniforms when thrown awkwardly or when the canister halves separated prematurely. Several documented accidents during training resulted in injuries when live or practice devices stuck to the thrower rather than the target. The Army's own assessment, recorded in contemporary reports, was blunt. The weapon was hazardous to its operator in a way that few issued munitions were tolerated to be, and it was eventually withdrawn from official British and Commonwealth frontline issue by 1943, though stocks continued to circulate informally and through SOE channels well beyond that date. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operational use of the sticky bomb is frustratingly patchy in the historical record, precisely because so much of its real combat history occurred outside formal Army command structures, in the hands of resistance fighters whose own records were deliberately destroyed for security, or simply never kept at all. What does survive points to a weapon used in genuine desperation. In the North African campaign, Australian troops at Tobruk in 1941 are recorded using sticky bombs against Italian and German armor during the siege, with at least one well-documented action where defenders disabled tanks that had broken through forward positions, buying time for reinforcement. Home Guard exercises across Britain throughout 1940 and 1941 incorporated the weapon extensively, training tens of thousands of volunteers in its use against mock German invasion forces that, in the event, never materialized on British soil. It was in occupied Europe, however, distributed through SOE supply drops to resistance cells in France, Belgium, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere, that the weapon found its quiet, undocumented second life. Incidents, like the one near Bowles described at the start of this story, are drawn from the pattern of documented SOE-supplied sabotage actions, though many specific engagements remain anecdotal, recorded years later in veteran testimony rather than contemporary reports, and historians must treat such accounts with appropriate caution. What is consistent across surviving accounts is the psychological effect described by German crews who survived sticky bomb attacks. The unnerving experience of an explosion that came not from artillery in the distance, but from something attached directly to their own vehicle, often without warning, suggesting an enemy close enough to touch the tank itself. Compared internationally, the sticky bomb sits in an unusual position. Germany never developed a direct equivalent, relying instead on the Hafthochladung, a magnetic hollow charge device introduced from 1942, which used magnets rather than adhesive to attach to armor, and employed a shaped charge for genuinely superior penetration, reportedly capable of defeating up to 140 millimeters of armor. The German solution was, in pure engineering terms, more sophisticated and more lethal. The American equivalent, the M3 anti-tank rifle grenade, and later improvised sticky-type charges, never achieved widespread issue in the same desperate, mass-produced way because American industrial capacity allowed faster development of the bazooka, fielded from 1942, which rendered crude sticking charge concepts largely redundant for U.S. forces. Britain's sticky bomb was, in essence, a stopgap born of genuine national emergency in 1940, filling a 15-month gap before the PYAT arrived in 1943, a gap that other nations either did not face in the same severity or filled through different means. The historical impact of the sticky bomb is therefore best understood as overwhelmingly psychological and improvisational rather than statistically decisive. No reliable wartime tally exists of confirmed tank kills, and given the chaotic, often unrecorded circumstances of its resistance use, no honest historian claims a precise figure today. What can be said with confidence is that it gave hundreds of thousands of otherwise lightly armed defenders, civilian volunteers in 1940, partisans in 1944, the genuine capacity to engage armor at all, which mattered enormously for morale even where material destruction was limited. It also represents one of the clearest examples of Churchill's toy shop philosophy, that imperfect weapons rushed into service beat perfect weapons that arrive too late. Surviving examples, both live deactivated and training variants, can today be seen in the collections of the Imperial War Museum in London and in several regimental and home guard museums across Britain. Return for a moment to that ditch near Bowles, to Henri lying flat with woolen sock and glass globe in his hands. He had no anti-tank gun, no bazooka, nothing resembling the proper tools of armored warfare. What he had was a weapon designed in a country house in Hertfordshire by men told simply to solve an impossible problem quickly, using birdlime, glass, and nitroglycerin because nothing more sophisticated could be built in time. The sticky bomb was never elegant. It stuck to the wrong things as readily as the right ones. It terrified the men who trained with it, and the regular army abandoned it the moment something better arrived. But for a desperate window in 1940, and for resistance fighters who had nothing else for years afterward, it did the one thing that mattered. It made tanks stop dead in fields and on farm tracks across occupied Europe, when by every reasonable expectation they should have rolled on unopposed. That, in the end, is the entire story of British wartime improvisation in miniature. Not the pursuit of the perfect weapon, but the urgent manufacture of something good enough, right now, to stop the enemy where they stood.